Hey everybody, my name is Luke Sittenauer, and for the month of October, I'm going to do something a little bit different. So we're still going to do Titans, and I'm hopefully going to do Arrow, maybe Batwoman, just shows like that. But I'm thinking about twice a week. I'm going to retroactively review horror movies throughout history. Today we're looking at The Evil Dead. Next week we're going to be You're Next. So yeah, and then every week throughout October we're going to look at two different horror films. So let's just start with The Evil Dead, one of my personal favorite horror movies of all time. So this is obviously the original 1981 version. Okay, so the movie starts with kind of this sort of like a gliding first person over like this swamp mire area. And the way they got this shot was Sam Raimi, director Sam Raimi, was leaning was laid flat on like this little boat thing, and Bruce Campbell stood in the swamp and he pushed him across the water. So that's how they got this sort of opening, sort of gliding, um, first person gliding effect over the water. Okay, so now we meet our characters. Our five main characters are Ash, Linda, Scotty, Shelly, and Cheryl. They're all in their car about to enjoy a weekend in a cabin in the mountains. And so Scotty's driving, and he asks Ash where they are. And he's having trouble reading the map, and they almost get into a collision because of it. Um, and this is Sam Raimi's dad's car. It makes an appearance in every one of his films. It's the 1973 Delta 88 Classic. Don't ask me how I know that. And so they pass two guys on the way to their cabin. They pass two dudes. This is a cameo from producer Robert Tappert and director Sam Raimi himself. And as they go over the bridge, a piece of wood falls off, and Ash is like, "Oh, the bridge is super strong," and he kind of looks down, and it's sort of a funny moment. And so Sam Raimi has history with comedy. That's like what he's most familiar with. And this film isn't a comedy. It's a straight horror film. It's it's intense. um, but there are little moments throughout the movie that are kind of like that's kind of funny because Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell and Robert Tapper, they actually were make used to make home videos together. They started out making Three Stooges parodies, and so yeah, their background is comedy, and so we kind of see that in some of the sequels. They get more silly as the Evil Dead series continues. But it's sort of interesting to think that these people who made this incredibly intense film, they make comedy. Anyway, so we get our first shot at the cabin, but first we get this sort of tracking shot of the car, and the way like the branches sort of bang up against the camera, and there's like one branch that gets caught on the car, and the car drags it along the ground for a little while. It's kind of ominous, a little foreshadowing. Um, and then they get out of the car. The four stay behind. Ash, Linda, Shelly, and Cheryl stay behind. Scotty sort of gets out, and the character of Scotty is sort of meant as like sort of like the hero archetype, even though he's not the main character. Ash is, but it's sort of meant to believe that Scotty's sort of this safe character. He's sort of the hero of the film, and sort of the series of Evil Dead will kind of play off of that throughout, like sort of play with heroism. And Ash is sort of not at all what we think of as a hero, but he still somehow survives all these crazy events. And finally, at the end of part three, Army of Darkness, he finally sort of embraces the hero arc throughout all three films. But right now, it's sort of we're sort of tricked into thinking that Scotty's sort of this masculine character, and so he's the first person to sort of go to the cabin as that bench is kind of banging against the wall. He's the first person to kind of get in there because he's sort of this strong macho type. And Linda, so she's wearing an MSU jacket, sweater, because Ash, Robert, I'm sorry, Bruce Campbell, Robert Tappert, and Sam Raimi dropped out of MSU to Michigan State to make this movie. And so this is interesting. They get the first shot into the cabin, and for the Evil Dead, the first movie was filmed in a cabin in Tennessee, but shortly after they finished filming, it was burned down in a lightning storm. So it's sort of interesting how the sequels make the interior of the cabin look so much like it does in this movie, even though they couldn't go to the same location because it burned down. Um, and then sort of, I talked about the character of Scotty, but I want to talk about Ash for a little bit. So, in this scene, they're sort of unloading the car, but they're kind of throwing stuff at Ash, and he catches the first couple of them, but then he gets hit because he's sort of a bumbling idiot. And these first scenes are sort of um, introducing us to that, and it sort of builds on throughout the movie. Anyway, so then as Scotty sort of tours through the cabin, he goes through the work shed, a place that's going to become very iconic throughout the series. And then we get to the first sort of scary scene of the movie is where Cheryl is sort of drawing a picture of the clock, and her hand sort of wigs out and draws this weird book, SpongeBob looking thing. We don't know what it is yet, but it just, remember that. It's this book with a face on it. This scene was originally longer because I read the script. Yeah, don't act surprised. I read the script of this movie, and this scene was a little bit longer. So she draws this weird book, this rectangle thing with a face on it. And in the extended scene of this in the script, Scotty sort of comes over and mocks her about it. But anyway, it's just that, and then it cuts to a red smoothie being made. And I don't think this is a coincidence because this movie is very bloody, and we'll see that soon. And here's another Ash being stupid scene. He tries to make a toast in Greek, but he fumbles and he can't remember the words. And so then the next thing, the cellar door just bursts open, right? And so obviously Scotty's the first person to go down with the flashlight, and after he's down there for a couple minutes, they send Ash down there. And when Ash goes down, we get our first look at the cellar. It's sort of this 360 kind of long take. It's really, really cool. And then Ash goes further into the cellar. He sees this workbench table thing with the recorder, the Necronomicon, which is the book that Cheryl was drawing. It was a picture of the Necronomicon. There was a shotgun and the Kandarian dagger. But on the wall behind it, there's a poster for The Hills Have Eyes, a horror film by Wes Craven. And so this is the first of sort of a back and forth between Wes Craven and Sam Raimi. So in A Nightmare on Elm Street, the kids are watching The Evil Dead. But then in Evil Dead 2, there's a Freddy Krueger glove, the ones with the knives on it, hanging on the wall in the basement of the cabin. And then in Scream, I think the kids are watching Evil Dead as well. I could be wrong, but I think that's what it is. And the gun they use in this movie is real. So when Scotty points the gun at Ash, that's really a gun pointed at Bruce Campbell's head. So, yeah, it's real. It's a real gun. And so this is our first real look at the Necronomicon. It's a book that's bound in human flesh and inked in human blood. So that's really weird. And there's like this face that's sort of carved into it, carved into the flesh of this book. Anyway, so they go up to listen to the tape recording, and Scotty says the phrase, "I'm going to break your face." I don't know the significance of this phrase, but it does pop up a couple of times in the franchise. So maybe it has some significance to Sam Raimi or one of the actors or something, but anyway, it has some significance to something because it keeps coming up. They played the recording, and this is the first introduction to Professor Noby we get. And it sort of talks about how he took the book and his wife to this sort of secluded cabin where they could study it for a little while and sort of read it and see what it does, sort of experiment with it. And yeah, so throughout this, Cheryl's kind of disturbed by this recording, and Scotty's kind of teasing her about it. So it's just more of his character. We'll see more of his negative attributes later on, but that's sort of his macho. That's definitely a word for it. Macho type character. And at the climax of this particular scene, there's a tree that just smashes through the window, and they pause the recording, and Cheryl starts screaming. And in the next scene, we get a Ash and Linda they're dating, and he gives her sort of a magnifying glass necklace. Um, yeah, so that's gonna be important. Remember that it's gonna be important. And so we get sort of this first person view. Sam Raimi calls it the Force, but that's from Star Wars, so we can't say that. But it's just sort of this view, I guess, is what I'll call it. And so it breaks through the window. And how they achieved this scene was they got a T, they got 2x4 long ways and a 2x4 this way, made it like a T, and they put the camera on the end and they just shoved it through the window. So that's how they got that sort of first person breaking through the window. And then we get the titular phrase, the join us. It's never really explained what this means, but it's something that comes up a lot in the series, to just join us. And so this next scene, well, it's the tree scene. I'm not going to explain what happens. But those of you who've seen it, you know what happens. So Sam Raimi has said that his intent with this scene and this whole movie basically is to shock people, not to offend them. And he didn't know that this particular scene would offend people. I kind of find that hard to believe. I sort of understand that in a way, but he didn't think for a second this would offend anybody. And the actress's defense, she says that because it was filmed in reverse, there wasn't a way for her to tell exactly how far it was going to be taken. And as for the tree, he hasn't found any work since. Rip tree. And anyway, while Cheryl runs back, she makes it to the door of the cabin, and so she's kind of fumbling with the keys, and as the view gets closer and closer and closer, the music sort of has a heartbeat, like a drum that sounds like a heartbeat, and it gets louder and louder and quicker, until finally Ash grabs her and pulls her in. Anyway, and then so he closes the door, and the view stops. So for whatever reason, in this movie, the view cannot go through the door. So it just turns around. It can't go through doors at all, for whatever reason. It can break through windows, but not doors. Anyway, so Cheryl convinces Ash to take her back. So they get into the car, and he's having trouble with it. She's like, the car's not going to start. It won't let us leave. The car's not going to start. But the car starts. Just immediately after she says that. So then they go back to the bridge I was talking about earlier. And so, like, imagine, like, the bridge is like this, right? But now when they go, it's like that. It's like broken up. It's it's a cool shot, but I don't know, other than Supernatural, which is obviously a supernatural in the case of this movie, but I don't know how you could break the bridge, naturally break a bridge like that. And then there's a really cool shot of like Cheryl's having like this breakdown because she can't leave, and the only lighting in this scene is the car lights. And so Ash is trying to comfort her, and she's just like breaking down in front of this car lights. It's a cool scene. And we cut immediately to Scotty cutting wood with an axe. And this axe is going to be important in this movie. Later on in the series, it would be a chainsaw, but in this movie, it's an axe. And so Ash is listening to a recording of the rest of the recording from Professor Nobi. And he reveals that after reciting the incantations of the book, the Necronomicon, his wife got possessed. And the only way to stop this, because he says that they're never really dead, the only way to stop it is to completely bodily dismemberment. Just like completely just cut them apart. And then we get one of my favorite scenes in the movie. It's the card scene. So, remember that scene, the intro scene for the Ghostbusters, where they're trying to do the ESP thing, but the girl keeps getting the cards wrong. He says they're getting it right. It's basically like that, but it's with Shelley and Linda. So Shelley just has these cards, and the camera can see that it's the wrong card. But whatever Linda would say, Shelley's like, "Oh, you got it." And so Linda's like, "Oh, look, I think I got ESP, Ash." And Ash is like, "Wow, it's truly amazing, Linda." So that's one of those things I was talking about earlier, where it's like, that's supposed to be funny, right? Like, that's on purpose? Because I don't know. It's genuinely funny, and I'm not sure. I don't know. But then we get Deadite Cheryl. And she starts predicting the cards right again and again and again, and she just like sort of starts levitating and yelling at them. And then she grabs a pencil and stabs it into Linda's foot, the ankle area. And this is one of those scenes where I think if you asked anybody who's seen this movie what is the most painful part of this movie, they'll probably say the pencil scene. Because he just stabs it in there and the blood just comes like gushing out. And then Deadite Cheryl grabs grabs Ash and chucks him at a bookshelf. And this is actually a real bookshelf that Bruce Campbell was actually thrown into. There's a couple of these scenes in this movie, but yeah, that's really what's happening is he's being thrown into a real bookshelf. Anyway, Scotty manages to grab Cheryl and lock her up in the cellar. And during this scene, it's very obvious that the makeup on the Deadite has changed. It's abundantly clear. I don't know why this is, but it just happens. So then we get the first person view from Cheryl in the cellar. So it's kind of like that. The door is just a little cracked open so she can stick her eyes through. And then Shelley gets the iconic line of, what's happened to her eyes? This actually gets quoted a lot in other movies. What happened to her eyes? And then that we get the T-frame, like I mentioned earlier, with the camera again. But this time it's into Shelley's bedroom, and then she becomes a Deadite, and Scotty finds her in the bathroom, and she like grabs his face and like cuts it down. It's super, super painful. And then he manages to take her into the living room and knock her into the fire. And so this is where we first get our hint that they're weak to fire. And that's only in this movie that they're weak to fire. It's retconned later that they're not, but this movie they are. And so Scotty pulls her out of the fire because he thinks, I don't know what he's thinking, but he pulls her out of the fire. She's like, oh, thank you saved my flesh. Now I'm going to eat you. And so she grabs the Kandarian dagger and she's going to stab him with it, but then he has his pocket knife and he goes up and he cuts her wrist with it. And then she takes it and bites her hand off. And then he grabs her hand and then he stabs her with it. And that kills her. So in this movie, the Deadites are weak to bodily dismemberment, fire, and the Kandarian dagger. And then once it's in her back, it starts smoking. And this is something interesting in this movie. An interesting touch is that whenever the Deadites get hurt in any way, they just spit up milk. Like it's 2% milk and they just spit it out. Sam Raimi said that it's his way of making them seem sort of inhuman. Oh no. I guess she didn't die then, because then she goes to attack Ash, who's holding the axe, and he can't bring himself to do it. So then Scotty does it, and he completely dismembers her. And while he's doing it, we get the first-person view of Deadite Shelley, and the blood is just completely covering the camera to the point of it almost being black. We can't see it because there's so much blood covering the camera. And then they go out and they bury Shelley. And then they go inside, and Scotty's like, I want to go. I gotta go. And Ash is like, we can't, because Linda can't walk because she hurt her ankle. And Scotty's like, I don't care what happens to her. I need to leave. And then we get another one of my favorite lines in this movie. Another indication that I think was actually kind of funny, because Cheryl's still in the cellar, and she says, "Soon you'll all be like me, and then who's gonna put you in the cellar?" That's a genuinely funny line. And so then Ash goes to check up on Linda, and so he pulls the blanket back and looks at her ankle, and so we see it from the pencil wound. It's just started spreading like a spider web all up her leg. And she turns into a Deadite. And so actually, after Scotty said he doesn't care, he left. And now he's come back and he's all just bloody. And we don't ever know what happened to him. But it's implied that something bad happened because he's just completely just bloody. And it's this scene where the Deadites turn back to normal. So Linda's normal, Cheryl's normal. Shelley's dead, but the other two girls are normal. And they're just completely normal, and everything's fine. So then Ash goes down to check on Cheryl, and her hands just burst through the floor, and they grab him. and they're back to Deadites again. And this is where we get that song. In my short film Don't Scream, I use this song. We're gonna get you. Na, na, na. I don't know exactly how it is, but it's scary. Like, I just have Linda sings because I just know it in my head. I can't sing it, but just look it up or just watch the film. It's the first scene of Don't Scream. And then so Ash literally just grabs her by her legs, pulls her outside the door, and just closes the door. Very short-term solution, but it works for like 5 seconds. So this is the part where, and in between, so he drags her out, closes the door, goes back, finds Scotty dead, right? And then so Linda gets back in, and she stabs Ash, and then with the Kandarian dagger, and then she licks it. So apparently the Deadites have to be stabbed by it, because she licks it, and she's totally fine. She licks the blood off of it, she's fine. But then Ash takes her hand, because she's holding onto the dagger, puts it behind her back, and then she falls over on top of it, impaling herself. This doesn't kill her, but it subdues her temporarily. And then Ash takes Linda to the work shed. He ties her up on the workbench, and then he goes to grab the chainsaw. He starts it up, but then he can't bring himself to do it. So he puts it back, and he just goes and buries her. And while he's burying her, we sort of get a back and forth. Linda's kind of breaking out. You can see the bolts kind of coming apart. And as Ash is burying her, we cut back and forth several times. And after Linda's completely buried, we see the magnifying glass necklace. So as Ash goes down to grab it, Linda's hand comes out and grabs his hand, and then she comes out of the ground. Ash grabs this wooden log and starts wailing her with it. I think wailing her with it, I think is the correct way to say it. I don't know. It's late. So he hits her with it. She grabs it and flips him over. And so he's laying on the ground. She jumps up. He grabs the shovel and completely just whacks her head clean off. And that does it. Like, she's not dead, but she's basically done for in this film. He goes back inside and he shoots Cheryl. And so then she falls out the window. And then he rushes to all the doors to try to close them. But then he finds out he's out of shells. So he goes down to the cellar, and so the sewer pipes start bursting open in blood, and he's just covered in it. And then the outlets, the electrical outlets, they start oozing blood out of the holes. And there's one scene with a light bulb that just floods over with blood. Sam Raimi has said that this is actually a reference to an episode of The Three Stooges, where it's like water. There's a plumbing themed episode, and it's just water that's going everywhere. And then for whatever reason, a record player starts playing old happy music, old time music, and then there's the projector that gets covered in blood. So it looks like he's covered in blood, but it's just a projector. And then we get Scotty Deadite, and I don't remember a whole lot of him. Honestly, I sometimes forget that Scotty was even a Deadite at all. Anyway, so Ash figures out he lassos the book with so the Deadites have him on the floor, they're on top of him, and they're beating him. So he manages to take the magnifying glass necklace, lasso it around the Necronomicon, and he uses that to throw it into the fire. And that sort of damages the Deadites. So the Deadites in this movie are connected to the Necronomicon. So when it burns, they start to burn. And so then the two Deadites that are left, Cheryl and Scotty, they basically start melting. It's really kind of a cool effect, like a stop motion effect. And obviously they have blood, they have milk coming out of their mouths, and grits coming out of their arms, like oatmeal grits. And then right before they completely die, these giant hands just shoot out of their bodies. I don't know why, but I don't know. And so then Ash, after he defeats it, he walks outside. It's morning, it's all happy, everything's fine, but then he turns around and the view just kind of runs into him and he screams, and that's it. It's the end of the movie. So, yeah, that's it. The Evil Dead. There are other sequels. I'm not going to get into them anytime soon. I don't plan on getting into those. Maybe at some point I will. But this is definitely my favorite in the franchise. I do really enjoy the franchise, but as I said earlier, they tend to get more silly, and this is just like more just scary and serious. So, what do you think about The Evil Dead? Comment below. Make sure to like the video, and if you enjoyed it, make sure to share and subscribe. You can join our Facebook group, Casual Experts. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at @the_LKX. You can contribute to us on Patreon. Link to all that, socials, Facebook group, Patreon, it's all going to be in the description below. So until then, next time, I'm Luke Sittenauer, reminding you to be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.